Good afternoon. Welcome to week 9. This week we'll be talking about the executive branch. So this lecture is going to focus on the presidency, while the next lecture will focus on the federal bureaucracy. So today we'll be focusing on the process of electing the president, and as well as the powers of the presidency and how they have evolved over time. In discussion section, we'll talk a little bit about the framers' original justification for why the presidency is designed as the way it is. So the selecting a president starts with a nominating process, and this process itself changed over the course of time. Originally, there were the presidential candidates were nominated by party elites through this combination of state party members plus the congressional caucus. This was combined to kind of create what was known as the King Caucus. But the party elites, the leaders of the party, the elected representatives of the party at both the state and the national level, ultimately chose who would be the standard bearer for that party, who would represent the party on the presidential ticket. During the progressive era of the early 20th century, various reforms were put in place, such as the secret ballot, and to limit the limit the power of party elites and give more power to ordinary voters. This was part of a broader reform effort to limit political corruption and to decrease the power of political machines. And so this created a move towards state primaries and caucuses. So each state would have its own nominating contest, and then whoever won the most nominating contests would win. So primaries function more or less like elections. But caucuses are these kind of strange meetings in which people that are not based on single votes, but that everyone in the precinct gets together. All the members of that political party get together in the precinct, usually at a high school gym, and they try to persuade people to change their votes and coalesce around a single candidate. So there are multiple rounds of voting. The caucuses take hours usually. And what has ultimately happened is that these primaries and caucuses, they determine what delegates would go to the nominating convention, these delegates that are pledged to particular candidates. And ultimately, they made the nominating convention kind of a commercial. Everything has already been decided by these primaries and caucuses, and it's more of a formality, though there's always the possibility of a brokered convention. But the convention is usually just kind of to highlight the strengths and advertise for the already kind of presumed nominee. And so going directly to the people means that there's more uncertainty in the nominating process. You have a greater chance that you could have political outsiders like Reagan, Trump, Sanders, than kind of the traditional party elites winning the party nomination. Now, the nominating process today is really driven by the primary calendar. There's always a kind of jostling to move your state's primary or caucus up earlier in the primary calendar, because that would mean that your state is more valuable, and issues that concern your state are going to be talked about more in these earlier contests. That the candidates are going to be spending more time in the early stages of a campaign trying to win these early states in order to solidify momentum and going into the later states. And so there's a critique that because states like Iowa and New Hampshire have these early nominating contests, that this overrepresents the issues and voices of Iowa and New Hampshire, which are not particularly representative of the country as a whole. Now, the two parties have slightly different rules about how their delegates worked. At the Democratic Party, there are both pledged and automatic delegates, and the pledged delegates are the delegates that are won by the state nominating contests. But the automatic delegates this is where the idea of superdelegates came from. These are delegates that include members of the DNC, Democratic members of Congress, Democratic governors, or other distinguished party leaders, including former presidents and vice presidents, who are free to support any presidential candidate of their choosing. And while most states have rules pledging the delegates to particular candidates based on rules about where they placed in the primary or caucus. On the Republican side, there are no superdelegates, but some states have unpledged delegates. So, for example, 54 Pennsylvania's delegates at the district level are not bound to support any particular presidential candidate. They are just delegates that are sent to the convention and can vote for whomever. North Dakota does not hold a presidential primary or caucus in which citizens vote. All 29 of the state's Republican delegates are unpledged. And there are other states that have unpledged delegates that kind of go to the that you vote for the delegate to the nominating convention, and then they can vote for whichever candidate for that they want. And this all happens in the this winter, spring, and summer leading up to the nominating conventions that happen in the early fall. When we move from the nominating contest to the election of the president, we have to talk about the Electoral College. So originally, as written, it is based on the state electors would be given based on the representation that they have in Congress, that each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in Congress. So these were that each state would have electors based on the number of representatives and senators that they have. The electors were originally appointed by the legislature. They were not chosen by the people. There was no popular election for the president, but the state legislature would send their electors, and these electors would then be responsible for voting for a particular candidate. There was originally a two-person, you would vote with two ballots you would vote for two persons, you'd have two separate ballots, in which the winner would be the president and the second place would be the vice president. You didn't have like joint tickets, right? It would just be whoever got the second most number of votes. And in the case of any ties, the House of Representatives would break any ties. So originally, as written, the president was not elected, but the Electoral College was even less democratic than it is today. There was no kind of popular there's no popular kind of election for the president. Now today, the 12th Amendment separated the ballots for the president and the vice president. So the Electoral College votes one for president and one for vice president. So that it's not the case that the second place, the runner-up becomes the vice president. There are currently 538 electors, each representing one of the 50 states or the District of Columbia. In 48 states and the District of Columbia, the candidate who has the most votes are bound in that state are bound to that candidate. So the electors are bound to whoever wins the state popular vote in that state. In Nebraska and Maine, there are separate congressional districts. The candidate who wins the popular vote in the state gets 2 electoral votes, but the winner of each congressional district also receives an electoral vote. So that's why you have those stripy lines in Nebraska and in Maine. With 538 electoral votes, 270 are necessary to win. And so this creates these maps that we see here with some challenges, such as in 2000, where there was where Vice President Gore won the popular vote by over 500,000 votes. But because of the distribution of Electoral College votes, and yes, the colors are flipped from what you would normally expect here, President Bush ended up winning by 271 electoral votes, 267. Similarly, in the 2016 election, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by over 3 million votes, but because of particularly close elections in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Florida, the electoral vote was 304 to President Trump to 227 to Secretary Clinton. And then in the most recent election, you have the electoral vote flipping here, and in a case where the popular vote actually matches the Electoral College vote, but the proportions don't really add up. With a difference of about over 7 million votes, that does not correspond to an equal difference in the Electoral College vote. So there are many kind of complaints that what this ends up doing, as you can see from the difference between the Electoral College map in 2020 and 2016, is that this highly prioritizes voters in states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Florida, and now potentially Georgia and Arizona. not because that these are states that are particularly high in populations or representative of the country as a whole, but because that these are states that are closely divided between Republicans and Democrats, that a small number of votes in any of these states is enough to flip them. And with them, so also goes the nation. So you can see that Biden was able to flip Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Georgia, and win and flip the popular vote there. So that these are, so that the issues, the kind of issues for people in California, Texas, Montana, New York, Illinois aren't really raised because those are solid blue or red states. But the issues of citizens in these kind of swing states are going to be overrepresented in political debate. So what are the powers of the presidency? What can the president do? Well, formally, in Article 2, Section 2, the president is the commander-in-chief of the Army and the Navy. They are the head of the military. They're given deference in national security. They have the ability to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses. There's no limit to the presidential pardon power except for cases of impeachment. They have the power, with the advice and consent of the Senate, to make treaties, to nominate and appoint various executive officials and judges and ambassadors. So SCOTUS, Supreme Court, and the federal judiciary, ambassadors, cabinet level officials, and heads of executive offices, other non-political positions like the Federal Reserve, the FEC. These are nominees that are made by the president with the consent of the Senate. In Article 2, Section 3, the president is required from time to time to give Congress information on the state of the union and recommend to their consideration such measures he shall judge necessary and expedient. So the State of the Union address is literally in the Constitution. They can convene both houses of Congress during extraordinary occasions or moments of crisis. They have the power to receive ambassadors and part of their conducting foreign affairs. And they have the ability to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. So this is what we'll talk about in a second, the power of executive orders. They also have the authority to commission all officers of the Army and Navy, part of their power as commander and chief. So moving to this question of executive orders, where we have a kind of update on the classical reload here. Okay, I got that fixed. An update on the classic schoolhouse rock on how bills bills become laws or how laws are made here.
We now return to a brand new.
So where does the authority to pass an executive order come from? It's an implied power from the executive power language of the Constitution and the take care clause of the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't actually say that the president can pass executive orders, but that this is grounded in the fact that the Constitution gives all executive authority to the president and empowers the president to take care that the laws are enforced. So executive orders themselves are presidential directives that have the force of law. Usually these are directives to how agencies should conduct government business. They can determine the internal structure of government agencies or respond to emergencies. They are subject to the checks and balances from both Congress, which can pass contrary legislation, and the courts. They can be ruled unconstitutional. But they have most famously been used in times of emergency, such as President Roosevelt's order in turning Japanese Americans in 1942, President Truman's directive desegregating the armed forces in 1948. The most famous presidential proclamation was Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, which declared enslaved persons in areas under the Confederate control to be free, with some exceptions. But these have become increasingly used and because of congressional gridlock. So for example, Executive Order 13653 in 2014 mandated that the federal government and the states take action to prepare the United States for the effects of climate change. This was issued under the Obama administration. And then in 2017, the Trump administration issued Executive Order 13783, which overturned 13653 and called for the elimination of regulations that placed undue burdens on the energy industry. And this ultimately is a function of congressional inaction on either direction on climate change. And so you have the growing use of these executive orders to kind of go around gridlocked Congress, which isn't able to pass significant legislation. So on issues like immigration, climate change, gun control during the Obama administration, that these are all issues where the president can take executive action. The presidents can also use signing statements, which are statements issued by the president when signing the legislation that indicate how they will interpret and enforce the legislation. These are less powerful than vetoes or executive orders, but Congress has complained that they derail legislative intent because the president can basically not fully rewrite, but reinterpret the law as written. These have been used since James Monroe was president, but have become also more common in the recent century. Finally, the president does not have the power of a line item veto, which is to veto specific lines of legislation. This was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in Clinton versus the city of New York. So the president ruled that would be infringing on Congress's legislative authority. So the president has to veto the bill fully, either fold the whole bill or accept the whole bill. That decision was in 1996. So the president can also shape policy informally. They can shape policy making informally by agenda setting through the State of the Union address. They can kind of set and presidential speeches. They can kind of suggest what Congress should focus on. They submit an annual budget request in which they request certain money to fund executive agencies, and those budget requests reflect kind of political priorities. How they appoint and who they appoint to head executive agencies like the EPA or the State Department or the Defense Department all can influence how the president is going to govern. And they can also try to influence by appealing directly to the public. And so there's been research in political science that has talked about some of these different informal powers. So a political scientist, David Neustadt, in 1960, described the power of the president not about the formally enumerated powers, because the presidency itself is relatively weak institutionally, and so to get their agenda passed, they have to bargain and negotiate with Congress. So Neustadt saw that the president, in order to get any sort of their agenda passed, had to be the kind of bargainer in chief. The example that he uses is LBJ in civil rights. Trying to persuade particular congressmen and trying to persuade particular senators and representatives to try to meet the kind of expectations of the people and get their agenda passed. Since they don't have like a voice in the legislature, they have to bargain and convince other people that the president's position is in their interest. And so this is going to kind of become a function of the particular bargaining skills and prestige of that particular president. And this has led to this kind of way of thinking about the president, that the president can kind of do whatever they want, that they should just they should just be able to bargain their way to getting their agenda passed. But there are some significant limits to this. The rise of mass media coverage makes it much more difficult for members of Congress to make concessions, especially with increased polarization and divided government. That with a 24-hour news cycle, it's really hard for any sort of concession that a Republican makes to a Democratic president or vice versa is going to be covered incessantly. And that's going to make it decrease the incentives that someone has to bargain with an opposing president. So that all of these kind of make it difficult for bargaining to work. And so this has led to a shift to what Samuel Cornell in 1986 called going public. So instead of going to Congress and try to bargain and negotiate with individual members of Congress, the president could go directly to the public to try to get the public to put pressure on Congress. So this can be seen in using public addresses that have been increasing since Reagan, and taking advantage of the national constituency that the president has, that the president claims to speak for the entire people, the entire nation, They're very public. Whatever the president does, whatever the president says is going to get reported on. And because bargaining has become more difficult, there's strategic room for the president to go public in order to try to appeal to the people directly to shape the electoral kind of calculus of members of Congress. However, doing so can make compromise harder later, right? If you're making a strong moral claim that there's a moral obligation to expand to expand protection, create a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants, or to pass gun control legislation. If once you make these strong moral claims, it can be hard to back down from these. They can make it harder to back down from these positions later to compromise. Polarization also makes it harder for presidents to go public because you're unlikely to persuade political opponents in the populace. And the opponents also can go public, right? That there can be media backlash. So you can think of the language around death panels in the Affordable Care Act. That opponents can go public as well. So what checks exist on the power of the presidency? The Congress, they can impeach the president, which would begin with articles drafted in the House of Representatives, which are then presented to the Senate, which votes as a jury trial, requiring a 2/3 majority of those present. The punishment is removal from office and potential disqualification for future office. The Congress can also hold oversight hearings on legislative actions. They can require, or executive actions. They can require heads of executive agencies to come and testify before Congress. They have the ability to pass legislation to pass laws, and they can override the veto. And they have the power to shape the kind of executive appointments through the advising consent law. And like I said earlier, executive actions are subject to judicial review, so there are judicial checks on executive authority as well. So since around the mid-20th century, there's been significant expansion of presidential power. In 1973, the historian Arthur Schlesinger coined the phrase the imperial presidency to describe the increasing power that the president has. Some of this is linked to discussion, the Cold War, increasing focus on America's role on the international stage. The war on terror has only increased this deference to the imperial president, to the presidency. The national bureaucracy has expanded. More and more people are involved, are working for executive agencies, and so the president has significant amount of power. So what evidence have people cited? The increasing size of the political staff of the executive office of the president, which is not subject to congressional or to Senate approval, that there's just more people working in the White House, that the president has relied more and more on implicit powers, which are not these kind of enumerated powers of the presidency, but these take care clauses and the executive authority clause that the presidency has kind of taken advantage of. Congress has become less and less willing to check the president, especially in matters of national security, and so that the president is really only accountable during elections, rather than more regular accountability through Congress. So, what explains the rise of presidential power? Some of this is congressional inaction. The rise of polarization. There's this. It's hard to. It's really there's no real incentive to challenge the president if you're a member of the same party, and it's hard to get support if you're in the opposition party from the other side to impeach the president or really check on the president. There's also been a decline in foreign policy expertise in Congress, which has led to the presidency gaining more and more power over foreign affairs. And as we'll talk about in discussion section, part of it is just the institutional justification of the presidency as a single person is able to act more quickly and more decisively than Congress, which is a collective body. There's also been what commentators have called deprofessionalization of the executive branch. Basically, the bureaucracy is intended, as we'll talk about in the next lecture, to have these kind of apolitical professional civil servants But more and more, the executive branch is being staffed by political operatives and political staff. There's also been judicial inaction. The federal judiciary has deferred to the presidency on issues of national security, in what's known as the Plenary Powers Doctrine, basically giving the presidency more or less open approval to make decisions with regard to foreign affairs and national security, and they've interpreted that to also include questions of immigration, saying that that they do not have the authority to check the president's power on these issues, because the president is the head of the state and the head of the military. So these are all different kind of reasons for why the presidency has been able to expand its power over time. So the next lecture is going to focus on the federal bureaucracy, the rest of the executive branch that's not the president and the vice president. And we will talk about the kind of what the federal bureaucracy does, how it's regulated and overseen in the next lecture. So I will see you all for that. Take care.